The words left Edmund Caro's mouth before he could stop them, and the moment they did, the cold air in the corridor seemed to grow colder still. He stood with his back turned to the door of the study, his hands clasped behind him, his jaw tight, and he said it as if the saying of it were nothing at all. "She means nothing to me, Holt, let her go." His butler, a tall and careful man named Holt, who had spent 31 years learning when to speak and when to hold his tongue, gave a single nod and said, "Very good, Your Grace." That was all, no protest, no question. Just 3 words delivered in the smooth and steady voice of a man who had heard many things in many corridors and had learned long ago that the things said in corridors were rarely the things that were true. Edmund did not turn around. He stood at the tall window at the end of the hall and looked out at the gray November morning. The grounds of Blackmere Hall stretched away from the house in long wet lawns that disappeared into low mist. The trees along the northern wall had lost most of their leaves. A crow sat on the iron gate and looked at nothing. The morning was the kind that made a man feel the year was ending and taking something important with it. He heard Holt's footsteps retreat down the corridor. He heard the quiet click of a door. He stood there for another full minute before he moved. Miss Clara Voss had arrived at Blackmere Hall 11 weeks earlier, on a morning much like this one, carrying a small leather trunk and a letter of introduction from the agency in London that placed educated women in the houses of those who needed them. She had come to serve as governess to his niece, a girl of 9 named Philippa, who was clever and restless and had already driven away 2 previous governesses in the space of 1 year. The first had left in tears. The second had left in dignified silence, but had written a very sharp letter afterward. Edmund had not expected much from the third. He had been wrong. Clara Voss was not what he had pictured. He had pictured a woman of middle age, a little worn, practical in the way that people who have carried difficult lives become practical. Clara was 26, with a serious face and eyes the color of dark river water, and she had walked into Blackmere Hall with the composure of someone who had learned very early that the world did not reward nervousness. She had shaken hands with the housekeeper, been introduced to Philippa, and within 4 days had the girl reading Latin roots and laughing at the same time, which no one at Blackmere had thought was possible. Edmund had noticed this. He had told himself he was simply relieved that the governess problem was solved. He had noticed other things too, and had spent considerably more effort telling himself he had not. He had noticed the way she spoke to the servants, without the sharpness that some educated women of reduced circumstances developed as a kind of armor. He had noticed the way she argued a point at dinner on the 2 evenings. He had been persuaded to join Philippa and her governess for supper, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a calm precision that made it very difficult to dismiss what she was saying without looking foolish. He had noticed the book she kept on the table beside her usual chair in the small sitting room on the east wing, which was a volume of Wordsworth with a cracked spine, and the look of something read many times over many years. He had noticed, one evening in late October, that she had left the book on the table in the library where he sometimes worked in the evenings, and that between pages 40 and 41 there was a small pressed violet, still holding a faint trace of purple, placed there as carefully as something put down in a place where it might be found. He had found it. He had stood there holding the book open for a long moment. Then he had closed it, placed it back on the table, and gone to bed. He had not slept well. That had been 3 weeks ago. And now, standing at the window listening to the crow on the gate shift its weight from one foot to the other, Edmund Caro told himself the same thing he had been telling himself for 3 weeks, that it was nothing, that she was nothing. That the whole careful, quiet problem of Clara Voss was solved now that he had told Holt to let her go. He believed none of it, but he said it to himself anyway, the way a man holds a coat closed against wind that is already inside. Holt found him there still, 15 minutes later, when he came back to ask about the arrangements for the week. "Your Grace," Holt said, "Miss Voss has asked whether she might have until noon to collect her things. The morning coach does not pass until 12:30. "Yes," Edmund said without turning, "of course." She also asked whether you might sign the second letter of character, the one for the northern counties. She had 2 copies prepared. Edmund said nothing for a moment. He had signed 1 letter already. A brief, proper letter that said Miss Clara Voss had served in his household competently and came with his recommendation. He had signed it without looking at her. She had been standing 3 feet away when he did it, and he had concentrated very hard on the signature and nothing else. "Send it to my study," he said. "I will sign it." "Very good," Holt said and went away again. Edmund signed the letter an hour later. He read it twice before signing it. It was a good letter. It said the right things. It would help her find a position without difficulty. He folded it and sealed it and left it on the corner of the desk and did not allow himself to think about why the act of sealing it made him feel as though he had just closed a door that he did not have the right to close. Clara Voss walked out of Blackmere Hall at 12 minutes past noon. She had been at the house long enough to know every room, every window, every sound the old building made at night when the temperature dropped and the timbers contracted. She had been there long enough that Philippa had stopped calling her Miss Voss and started calling her Clara, which Clara had not corrected because she had decided that formality between a child and the person responsible for her education served no one well. She had been there long enough that the cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Greer, had twice brought Clara a cup of tea in the evening without being asked, which in a house the size of Blackmere Hall was a gesture of considerable warmth. She had been there long enough that leaving hurt more than she had intended to allow. She did not allow herself to show it. She had been in a situation before once at another house where she had shown more than she should have, and what followed had been difficult and expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. She had learned from it. She had become very good at wearing her face like a smooth and unremarkable surface that told people only what she chose to show them. She said goodbye to Mrs. Greer, who pressed her hand and said nothing because she was a woman who understood when words made things worse. She said goodbye to the housemaids she had come to know by name. She said goodbye to Philippa, which was the hardest part, because Philippa was 9 years old and had a heart that was too large and too open to have learned yet how to protect itself. And the girl held on to Clara's hand until Clara gently removed it and said that they would write letters, and that writing letters was better than talking because you could say things in a letter that you could never quite get right out loud. Philippa said, "Is that true?" Clara said, "I think it might be." Philippa said, "Will you really write?" "Yes," Clara said, "I will really write." She meant it. She would write to the child. She would not write to anyone else in the house, because there was no one else in the house who had given her any reason to believe that a letter from her would be welcome. She walked to the front entrance of the hall with her trunk carried by one of the footmen. The sky outside had gone from gray to a deeper gray that promised rain before long. The gravel drive was wet, and the air smelled of cold stone and dead leaves, and the particular sharpness that comes before a hard winter. She did not look up at the windows of the house as she walked. She had decided, somewhere around the end of October, that Edmund Carew was a man who had built very high walls around himself, and was quite satisfied with the arrangement. She had decided this after 2 weeks of conversation at dinner that had been, in her private assessment, some of the most interesting conversation she had had in years, and one evening in the library when they had spent 2 hours discussing a book that they had both read and disagreed about, and the disagreement had been, she thought, the best kind, the kind where both people come away thinking harder than they had before. She had decided it after she had left the book on the library table with the violet inside, and had watched, in the days that followed, as he gave no sign of having found it or having understood what she meant by it. She had decided that Edmund Carew was a man who understood everything and chose to act on nothing. She had decided, because she was a practical woman with no inheritance and a disgraced father and a very limited margin for mistakes, that this was the kind of man she could not afford to be near. So she had asked herself for the remainder of her time at Blackmere Hall to simply do her work well and leave with her dignity complete. And when the morning arrived when she was called to the study and handed her letter, and told in carefully polite language that her services were no longer required, she had received this news with the same smooth face she had been practicing for years. She had nodded, she had thanked him. She had not asked why because she understood why, and because the asking would have cracked something in her that she was not prepared to let crack in front of him. The footman set her trunk down at the gate and tipped his hat and went back. Clara stood on the road and breathed the cold air and waited for the coach. It began to rain before the coach arrived. She stood in it and let it fall on her and thought, with a clarity that sometimes arrives when you are wet and cold and recently dismissed, and have nothing particular to protect yourself with, that she was 26 years old and had been careful and sensible, and had kept her heart behind a proper fence for 3 years, and that none of it had helped at all. Because here she was on a wet road in November, having just walked out of the house of a man she had felt more for in 11 weeks than she had felt for anyone in the previous decade, and she had not told him so, and he had not told her anything at all, and the whole thing was perfectly, completely, infuriatingly pointless. The coach arrived, she got on it. She sat with her trunk at her feet and watched Blackmere Hall disappear behind the trees. Edmund Caro, at that precise moment, was standing at the window of his study watching the gate. He stood there for some time after the coach had gone. Then he went to his desk and sat down and looked at the surface of it, which was clean and orderly and exactly as it always was, and he picked up his pen and held it and set it down again without writing anything. The study was quiet. The rain came against the window in small, persistent bursts. The clock on the mantel measured out the minutes with its usual indifference. Holt came in an hour later to ask about dinner. Edmund said he was not hungry. Holt removed the untouched tray from the corner of the desk, the one he had brought at midday, and said, "Very good, Your Grace," and left. Edmund sat at the desk until it was dark. He did not pick up the pen again. He thought about 7 words, said in a cold corridor to a man who had served his family for 31 years, and about the calm and particular way Holt had nodded when he said them, as though he had heard a man speak his own error aloud and was too wise and too decent to say so. He thought about a pressed violet between pages 40 and 41 of a volume of Wordsworth. He thought about a woman standing in the rain at his gate, waiting for a coach. He thought with the slow and uncomfortable clarity of a man who has run out of things to distract himself with, that he had made a very serious mistake. He did not yet know what he was going to do about it. But he knew, sitting there in the dark of his study with the rain on the window and the clock measuring out the minutes, that the answer he had given Holt in the corridor that morning was wrong, and that it had been wrong the moment he said it, and that the only thing more foolish than saying it once would be to spend the rest of the winter pretending he had meant it. He reached out in the dark and touched the corner of the desk where the Wordsworth sat. He had moved it there that morning before Clara left, when he had gone to the library and taken it from the table and carried it back to his study and put it on his desk without quite knowing why. He had not opened it. He had not needed to. He knew what was inside it. He sat there with his hand resting on the cover of the book and the rain coming hard against the glass now, and for the first time in 11 weeks, he stopped telling himself that any of it meant nothing. It meant everything. He had simply been too frightened to say so, and now she was 40 miles away on a coach in the rain, and he had no one to blame for that but himself. The clock struck 8. Edmund Caro sat very still in the dark, and the weight of what he had done settled over him like weather. Outside Blackmere Hall, the world continued with its usual business, knowing nothing of the weight that sat on the chest of its owner. Farms operated, tenants paid or delayed their payments. The village of Dunmore, which sat a mile from the Hall's south gate, carried on through the grey days of November the way it always had, with its baker and its blacksmith and its small post office where letters were delivered 3 days a week by a man on a brown horse who was never quite dry. Edmund managed his estate. He did what a duke was supposed to do. He read papers, he answered letters, he met with his steward, a practical man named Gale who was very good at numbers and very little interested in the private states of his employer, which Edmund at that particular time considered a quality of considerable value. He attended to Philippa, who was being educated now by a temporary arrangement with the vicar's wife, a woman of 50 who was perfectly competent but who Philippa had already informed Edmund was not nearly as good as Clara. Edmund had said that he was sorry to hear it. Philippa had looked at him with the particular direct gaze that 9-year-old girls possess when they have decided to make a point without quite making it out loud, and had gone back to her Latin exercises. The days passed, 10 of them, 15. The month turned. Edmund stopped going into the library in the evenings. He had not made a formal decision about this. He had simply found, the first evening he sat down in his usual chair with the intention of reading, that the chair on the other side of the fireplace, the one with the low table beside it where Clara had kept her things, was very present in its emptiness in a way that the chair had never been present when it was occupied. He had left. He had gone to the drawing room and sat in a chair he never usually sat in, and read the same page of a different book 4 times, without understanding any of it. After that he worked in the study. On the 17th day after Clara's departure, Edmund was standing in the corridor outside the room that had served as her private sitting room when she was at Blackmere. He did not know how long he had been standing there. He had been walking to the eastern staircase and had simply stopped. The door was closed. The room was empty. He knew it was empty because Holt had confirmed, when Edmund had asked with elaborate casualness 3 days earlier that the room had been cleaned and was ready to be used for something else whenever his grace decided. Edmund had said he had not decided yet. He stood at the door now and did not open it. There was nothing useful behind it. It was a room that had been made into an ordinary room again. But he stood there anyway, the way a person stands at the edge of something they have lost, not because standing there helps, but because moving away from it feels like a second surrender. He heard Holt's footsteps before he heard Holt's voice. "Your Grace." Edmund did not turn. He said, "Yes, Holt. The post has arrived. Leave it on the desk." A pause, not a long pause, but the kind that Holt sometimes inserted into a conversation to indicate that the next thing he said had been thought about carefully. "There is a letter from Miss Philippa's agency," Holt said. "They have sent the details of 2 candidates for the governess position. I thought you might wish to look at them before your meeting with Mr. Gale this afternoon." Edmund said nothing. "They are both qualified women," Holt said. "Well recommended." "No doubt," Edmund said. Another pause. "Shall I tell Mr. Gale you will meet him at 3, as planned?" "Yes," Edmund said. 3 is fine." He heard Holt's footsteps begin to move away. He heard them stop. "Your Grace," Holt said, "if I may." Edmund turned then, because in 31 years Holt had never begun a personal observation that way, and in 31 years Edmund had never heard Holt say "if I may" about anything that was not important. Holt was standing 6 feet away in the corridor, holding the morning's post in both hands, his face arranged in its usual careful expression, but with something behind it that Edmund recognized as the particular quality of a man who has decided to say a difficult thing and is going to say it regardless. "I have known you since you were 9 years old," Holt said. "In that time I have seen you afraid exactly twice. Once when your father died on the morning of the 17th of March, 1831. You were standing in this same corridor as it happens, and you did not make a sound, which was the most frightening thing I have ever seen a child do, and once this morning just now when you said her name." Edmund said, "I did not say her name." "You said Miss Voss," Holt said. "When you told me to leave the letter from the agency on the desk. You said you didn't need to look at it yet because it wasn't as though Miss Voss had been irreplaceable." Edmund remembered saying it. He remembered the exact tone he had used, which had been carefully flat. "You said her name," Holt said, "the way a man says the name of something he is trying not to think about. I have heard that tone before. Your father used it about your mother for 2 years after she died, and he never did get over using it." The corridor was very quiet. The rain had stopped in the night and the morning was clear and pale, and the light that came through the narrow window above the eastern stairs was thin and white and fell across the floor between them. Edmund looked at his butler. His butler looked back at him with the steady and unalarmed patience of a man who has said the hard thing and is content to wait. "That will be all, Holt," Edmund said. "Yes, Your Grace," Holt said and went. Edmund stood in the corridor for another moment. Then he walked back to his study and sat down at his desk and did not look at the post. He looked at the window. He looked at the surface of the desk. He looked at the volume of Wordsworth sitting at the corner of the desk where it had been for 17 days. He picked it up. He opened it to page 40. The violet was still there, small and perfectly preserved, holding its color in the way that certain fragile things do when they are kept in the right conditions. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about a woman who had placed it there carefully and deliberately, in a book she had left where he would find it, because she was a person who chose her words very precisely, and when words felt too direct she chose other things instead. A pressed flower, a placement, a small quiet statement that said, without saying it, that she had been thinking of him. He thought about himself, standing in the library with the book open in his hands, understanding exactly what it meant, and closing it and going to bed. He thought about what Holt had said. He thought about his father, who had spent 2 years saying his mother's name in a flat voice, and had never, in the 17 years he lived after her death, found another person who made him glad to come in from the rain. Edmund set the book down carefully, with the violet still inside it. He took a sheet of paper from the drawer. He picked up the pen. He held it over the paper for a long time. Then he wrote, in the careful upright hand he had been taught as a boy by a tutor who had believed that penmanship was the outer expression of a man's character. "Dear Miss Voss, I find I have made an error." He stopped. He looked at what he had written. Then he turned the paper over and started again. He wrote for a long time. The meeting with Mr. Gale at 3 o'clock came and went. Edmund did not notice. He wrote through it and beyond it and into the afternoon, which turned from pale to gold to the deep amber of late November light. And by the time the light changed, he had covered 7 pages in his careful upright hand and had said, across those 7 pages, a great number of things that he had never said to anyone in his life. He read them back. The word sorry appeared 11 times. The phrase I was a coward appeared twice. There was a passage near the middle that he read 3 times before deciding it was both true and more honest than he had ever been in any letter he had written in his life. He folded all 7 pages together and sealed them with the dark red wax he kept for correspondence, and wrote her name and the address of the coaching inn at Harwick on the front, because Philippa had told him 3 days ago, in the particular casual way of a child who has something to say and is waiting to be asked, that her Clara had gone to the village of Harwick 40 miles north to take up a new position. He held the sealed letter in both hands. He set it on the corner of the desk. He did not send it. He was not able to explain, even to himself, precisely why. It was not that he doubted the truth of what was inside it. It was more that the letter, for all its 7 pages, felt like a continuation of the same cowardice that had let her walk out of his gate in the rain. A letter could be written and sealed and never answered. A letter was clean and contained, and allowed him to remain, even in the act of reaching out, behind the glass of a window looking at the weather rather than standing in it. He did not know yet what the alternative was, but he knew that the letter on his desk was not enough. He left it there and went to bed and spent a long night listening to the wind come down from the north, which had turned sharp and cold in the way that meant the real winter, the kind that closed roads and whitened fields and made the world contract to the distance a man could see from a lit window was on its way. He slept eventually. The letter sat on the corner of the desk in the dark. It held everything he meant, and nothing he was brave enough yet to do. The North had a way of keeping its winters to itself until the last possible moment, and then delivering them all at once, like a man who has been quiet in a conversation, and then says something that changes the entire room. It had been cold for 2 weeks, steadily and without drama, the way November in England is cold, a damp and grey kind of cold that settles into stone walls and morning coats and the joints of people who have spent too many years outdoors. But the real winter, the one that had been building somewhere above the moors, arrived on the night of the 12th of December and did not ask permission. Edmund woke to a world that had gone white. He stood at his bedroom window in the grey pre-dawn and looked out at the grounds of Blackmere Hall, which had been erased. The lawns were gone, the paths were gone. The stone wall along the northern edge was visible only as a low ridge under a smoothed-out blanket of white that gave no indication of the geometry beneath it. The trees stood bare and dark against it like pen marks on a clean page. The iron gate was buried to the hinge. The road beyond was not a road anymore. It was simply a field that ran in the same direction as a road. Snow in England does not often fall deep enough to change the landscape completely. When it does so with a totality that makes the familiar world seem like something that had been provisional all along, a temporary arrangement that the real world has now reclaimed. Edmund stood at the window for a long time. He had spent the past 3 weeks in the careful management of a private state that he had not shared with anyone except Holt, and only partially with Holt. He had gone about his days with the same measured efficiency that had characterized his adult life, and in the evenings he had sat at his desk with the sealed letter and the Wordsworth, and had thought about Clara Voss with the particular intensity of a man who has allowed himself to feel something without yet allowing himself to act on it. He had written 2 more drafts of the letter, both longer than the first, both sealed and placed beside the original on the corner of the desk. He had not sent any of them. There were now 3 sealed letters on his desk, each one more honest than the last, none of them posted. That morning he went downstairs and asked Holt to bring the newspaper. He ate breakfast, which he did not taste, and read the paper, which he did not absorb, and then at the bottom of the 3rd page, in a small block of text beneath the agricultural reports, he read that the northern roads had been closed since the previous evening due to heavy snowfall, and that the village of Harwick, among several others in the northern district, was reported to be without post or external supply. He read it twice. Harwick. He set the paper down on the table. He sat for a moment. The dining room was quiet, a fire burned in the grate. Through the tall windows, the white world outside was perfectly still, the way deep snow makes things still, absorbing sound and motion alike, turning the world into a held breath. He stood up. He went to find Holt. Holt was in the passage outside the kitchen, speaking with the head groom about the horses and the condition of the stable yard. Edmund came down the back stairs, which he almost never used, and both men turned when they heard him. The groom, whose name was Carver, looked surprised. Holt looked, as he almost always looked, as though he had been expecting this. "Holt," Edmund said, "have Carrick saddled." The groom said carefully, "Your Grace, the road north is not passable by carriage. There's 2 feet of snow on the high ground, the messenger said this morning." "I know," Edmund said, "I am not taking the carriage." Holt said without hesitation, "Shall I pack a second coat, Your Grace?" "Yes," Edmund said, "and the letters in my desk drawer, all 3, and the Wordsworth." Carver the groom opened his mouth and then closed it again, with the expression of a man who has decided very quickly that this is not his conversation. Holt simply said, "Very good," and went up the back stairs to do it. Carrick was the horse Edmund had owned longest, a dark gray animal of 15 years with a broad chest and a steady disposition, and the kind of character that was forged in the gap between intelligence and stubbornness. He was not a young horse, but he was sound and he was sensible, which in the conditions of that morning was worth more than speed. He stood in the yard with his head up and his breath coming in clouds in the cold air, watching the world with the calm alertness of an animal who understood weather and had already made his own assessment of it. Edmund mounted at 9:30 in the morning. Holt handed up the saddlebag with the coats and the letters and the book. He did not say anything about the road or the snow or the common sense of the enterprise. He looked up at Edmund with the expression he reserved for the rare occasions when Edmund was doing the right thing, and said, "She'll be at the wool merchant's house on the East Lane, Your Grace. It's the largest house on that side of the village, White Gate." Edmund looked down at him. "How do you know that?" "Miss Philippa told Mrs. Greer," Holt said. "Mrs. Greer told me. I have been waiting for you to ask." Edmund looked at his butler for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Holt." "Ride carefully," Holt said, which was, from Holt, both advice and something more than advice. He stepped back. He did not watch from the gate. He went back inside because Holt was not a man who needed to watch things to know how they would end. The road out of Blackmere was passable as far as the South Village, where the farmers had already been out with shovels clearing their own gates, and the path to the well. Beyond the village, the road became less a road and more a direction. The snow was deep enough on the open ground to come to Carrick's knee, and the horse moved through it with his particular quality of reluctant but reliable effort, placing his feet with care, reading the ground beneath the white surface the way experienced animals do, by memory and by the small clues that snow cannot entirely erase. Edmund rode. The sky above him was the pale white gray of a sky that has already given up its snow and is deciding whether to give up more. The fields on both sides of him were blank and silent. The hedgerows were rounded with white. Where the road climbed above the valley floor to the higher ground between Dunmore and the northern district, the wind came at him from the northwest, not sharp but steady, the kind of wind that does not hurry but does not stop either, and it found every gap in his coat and his gloves and pressed against his face with the patient persistence of cold at altitude. He rode through it. He lost the road twice on the high ground. The first time, Carrick stopped and stood still for a moment, and Edmund let him, and after 20 seconds the horse stepped slightly to the left and found firmer ground beneath the snow where the old road surface lay, and they went on. The second time was in a shallow valley where the snow had drifted chest-high against the far bank, and there was no way through it, and they went around through a field gate that was visible only by the top bar of the iron frame above the snow, and the field beyond it was rough going, but it was passable, and it brought them back to the road a quarter-mile further north. Edmund did not stop to wonder whether he was being reasonable. The time for being reasonable had been 11 weeks ago when a woman had placed a violet in a book and left it where he could find it. He had been reasonable then. He had been reasonable to a degree that had taken considerable effort and had cost him, as far as he could now determine, more than he knew how to calculate. He was done being reasonable. The miles passed slowly. Carrick moved at the pace the ground allowed, which was not fast, and Edmund settled into the rhythm of it, the horse's breath coming in regular white bursts, the creak of the saddle, the muffled sound of hooves in deep snow, the wind from the north. He had 40 miles to cover. He had left at 9:30. The December day would be dark before 4 in the afternoon. He did not hurry what could not be hurried. He let Carrick find the pace and he sat to it and he thought. He thought about what Holt had said in the corridor, about the 2 times in his life he had seen Edmund afraid. He thought about his father, who had never recovered the habit of gladness after his mother died. He thought about being 9 years old in a corridor, and not making a sound because the alternative was coming apart in a way that a duke's son, or so he had been led to believe, should not do. He thought about the 11 weeks Clara had been at Blackmere Hall, and about the particular quality of those weeks, which had been different from the weeks before them in a way that he had noticed at the time and chosen not to name. He thought about the evening in the library when they had argued about the book for 2 hours, and about the moment near the end of that evening, when she had said something so precisely and exactly right that he had looked up at her and found her already looking at him, and the room had gone very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of sound, and they had both looked away at the same moment and returned to the argument, and he had not slept well that night either. He thought about 7 words said in a cold corridor. He thought about the sealed letters in the saddlebag behind him, and about whether words on paper, however honestly meant, were the right instrument for the repair of what he had broken. He thought about the distance remaining. He rode. The afternoon light began to change around 3 o'clock, going from white to gold to the particular amber of late winter light that lasts perhaps 20 minutes before it drops into blue and then dark. Edmund was on the lower road north of the valley by then, and Harwick was perhaps 5 miles ahead, and the snow was thinner down here in the shelter of the hills, and Carrick had found a steadier pace on ground that had the feel of a real road beneath it. He did not stop when the light changed. He rode into the blue and then into the dark, and the cold deepened with the dark the way it always does in the open country when there is no cloud cover, and the stars appeared above him in the cleared sky with the sharp and steady brightness of stars over snow. He could see well enough. The snow itself gave back the starlight. The road was visible as a slightly lower line in the white fields on either side, and Carrick followed it without difficulty now, because roads at night in winter are what this horse had been bred for, and both of them knew it. At some time that Edmund estimated was between 7 and 8 in the evening, he came down through a line of bare elms and saw the lights of Harwick below him, 5 or 6 lit windows in the dark, the lamp above the post office door, the faint glow from the inn at the far end of the village street. He stopped Carrick at the top of the hill and looked down at it. He sat there for a moment with the cold and the dark and the starlit snow around him and the small bright evidence of the village below, and he thought, with a clarity that comes only to people who have ridden 40 miles in a December night to correct a mistake they made in a hallway 11 weeks ago, that whatever happened at the white gate on the East Lane, he had already done the most important thing. He had stopped being afraid of it. He had stopped calling it nothing. He touched Carrick's side with his heel, and the horse moved forward, and they went down the hill together into the light of the village. The house with the white gate was the 4th on the East Lane, as Holt had said, and it was the largest on that side of the village, a square stone house of moderate size with a lit window on the ground floor and a lamp burning above the door. Edmund dismounted at the gate, his legs stiff from 8 hours in the saddle, and tied Carrick to the post beside it. He took off his gloves and put them in his coat pocket. He breathed out once. He unlatched the gate and walked up the path. He knocked. A maid came to the door. She was young, perhaps 16, and she looked at the person on her employer's doorstep with the open and uncalculated astonishment of someone who has not yet learned to arrange her face for unexpected visitors. What she saw was a tall man in a snow-covered coat, with the look of someone who has been traveling in hard conditions for a long time, and has arrived at a place he intended to arrive at, and this combination of snow and determination on the face of a person who was clearly not a tradesman, and clearly not a neighbor, produced in her an expression somewhere between surprise and the instinct to go and tell someone immediately. "Good evening," Edmund said. "I am Edmund Caro. I would be grateful if you could tell Miss Voss that I am here." The maid's mouth opened slightly. She said, "Miss Voss, sir." "Yes," he said, "if she is at home." The maid looked at him for one more second. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Will you wait here, sir?" and went at a pace that was technically not running down the hallway and disappeared through a door at the far end. Edmund stood at the open door. Cold air moved past him from outside. Inside the house it was warm, with the smell of a wood fire and cooking and the faint particular smell of a working household that is comfortable in itself. He heard, somewhere deeper in the house, voices. He could not make out the words. He waited. He heard footsteps, not the quick light footsteps of the maid. These were different, measured, as though the person coming had taken a moment to decide how to come. Clara appeared in the hallway. She was in her working dress, plain grey wool, with her hair not yet done for the evening, half up and half down in the way it must have been when the maid found her. She was carrying a candle in her right hand, and she stopped when she saw him, about 8 feet from the door, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. She looked at him, he looked at her. He was aware, standing there in his snow-covered coat, that he was not presenting himself at his best. He had been on a horse for 8 hours in freezing conditions, and his face was raw with cold, and his coat had a long dark streak of snow across the shoulder from a low branch he had ridden too close to on the high ground. He was carrying in his left hand the saddlebag with the letters and the Wordsworth, and he was aware that this too was not the posture of a man who had arrived with composed and deliberate dignity. He held out the saddlebag, for reasons he could not fully articulate even as he was doing it, and said, "I wrote you letters." Clara looked at the saddlebag, she looked at him, she said, "I know why you've come." "Then you know more than I did 3 weeks ago," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The candle in her hand did not waver. She said, "How far did you ride?" 40 miles, he said. "The roads north are closed. The newspaper said Harwick had been without post for 4 days and I could not send them." He paused. "That is not the whole reason I came." "I know," she said. She looked at him steadily. She had the same expression she had worn in the library when she had said something precisely right, careful and open at the same time, the expression of a person who has decided to be honest even though honesty costs them something. She said, "I left a violet in your Wordsworth." "I found it," he said. She said nothing for a moment, then she said, "I thought you had, you never said anything." "No," he said, "I was a coward about it." "I know that too," she said. There was no sharpness in it. It was simply a statement, the kind that a person makes when they have spent several weeks coming to terms with a fact and have now arrived at something beyond resentment. "I left it on purpose," she said. "I wanted you to know that I had noticed. That I had been thinking. I wanted to see if you would say anything." "I should have," he said. "Yes," she said, "you should have." They stood there in the cold draft from the open door. The maid had disappeared. The hallway was empty except for the two of them and the candlelight and the very large distance of the last 11 weeks. "I have been carrying the letter in that bag for 2 days, Edmund said. "I have been carrying the book for 3 weeks. I could not send the letter because it seemed insufficient. I rode here because the road was closed, and I told myself that was the reason, and I know now that it was not the reason. I rode here because the road being closed gave me the excuse I needed to do the thing I should have done 11 weeks ago." Clara looked at the saddlebag. "What does the letter say?" "A great deal," he said. "Too much, perhaps. The word sorry appears 11 times. I have told myself that is excessive, but I have not been able to remove any of them because each one refers to a different specific thing, and all of them are accurate." She was quiet, then she said very quietly, "There are 11 things to be sorry for." "At least," he said. Her mouth changed. It was not quite a smile. It was something softer than that and more complicated, the expression of a person who has been very serious for a very long time and is feeling, against their will, the first small movement of something that is not seriousness. "Come in from the cold," she said. "You look like you have been out in weather." "I have," he said. "I will tell Mrs. Hartley that you will need something warm," she said. "And Carrick will need to be stabled. I will have the boy see to him." She turned to go back down the hallway. Then she stopped and looked at him over her shoulder, still holding the candle, and said, "I read your copy of the Wordsworth, you know, before I left it in the library. I read every page that had a mark in the margin." Edmund said, "Those marks are private." "I know," she said without apology. "You have very good taste and terrible handwriting. I will have to teach you to form your letters properly." She went down the hallway. Edmund stood at the door for another moment. He was cold to his bones. He was tired in the way that only a long day in physical hardship can make a person tired, a deep and complete tiredness that sat in every part of him. He was standing in the doorway of a stranger's house in a village 40 miles from his own land in the middle of December. He felt unreasonably and completely as though he had arrived somewhere. He came in from the cold. He closed the door behind him. Down the hallway he could hear Clara's voice. speaking to the housekeeper about a room and a stable for the horse and something warm. She had the same tone she had used at Blackmere when she organized things, calm and precise and without fuss, as though the arrival of a snow-covered duke at 8 o'clock on a December night were something she had simply decided to absorb into the order of the household and manage accordingly. He stood in the hallway and looked at the closed door behind him. He thought about the corridor at Blackmere and the 7 words in Holt's face as he said them. He thought about the crow on the gate that November morning and the way the year had seemed to be ending. He reached into the saddlebag and took out the sealed letters, all 3 of them, and then the Wordsworth. He opened the book to page 40. The violet was still there. He closed it again and held it. Clara came back down the hallway and stopped when she saw him still standing there with the book in his hand. "There is a fire in the sitting room," she said. "Come and be warm." He followed her. The book was in his hand and the letters were in his coat pocket, and the house was warm around him, and the white world outside was still and cold and deep, and 40 miles to the south in the study of Blackmere Hall, the desk was clear for the first time in 3 weeks. The corner where the letters had sat for 17 days was empty. Holt walked past the study door at 8:30, saw the light still on and paused. Then he saw that the desk was bare, and he looked at the empty corner for a moment. Then he turned off the hall lamp and went to bed. He slept well. The village of Harwick did not often receive dukes. It was not the kind of village that attracted such visitors. It had no great house nearby to draw the aristocratic crowd. It had no celebrated inn or distinguished history. It had a wool merchant, a blacksmith, a post office, a church of moderate size and a vicar of moderate intelligence, a baker whose bread was very good, and approximately 200 people who all knew each other well enough to notice a strange horse in the stable yard of the wool merchant's house before they had even finished their breakfast. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the news had moved through the village the way news moves in small places, which is to say completely and without effort, carried on the invisible current of proximity that exists between people who live close enough together to know each other's business whether they intend to or not. Edmund woke in the spare bedroom of the wool merchant's house, in a narrow bed with a good mattress and 3 blankets that his host had insisted upon and which had been entirely necessary, and lay for a moment looking at the pale ceiling while the events of the previous day settled back into order in his mind. The room was cold in the way that rooms in old stone houses are cold in December mornings, a surface cold on top of the warmth that remains in walls that have been heated through the night. He could hear the house beginning its day, the sound of a door, the distant clatter of a kitchen beginning to work. He had met the wool merchant the previous evening. The man's name was Arthur Hartley, a solid and amiable person of 50 who had made his money with his own hands and his own intelligence, and had the particular ease of someone who is comfortable with who he is and does not need the company of important people to confirm it. He had shaken Edmund's hand with the direct grip of a man who was not in the habit of adjusting his grip for anyone, looked him in the eye, asked him if he was hungry, and on receiving an honest answer had told his wife to have the kitchen send up whatever was ready, and had sat Edmund down by the fire in the dining room, and talked to him about the state of the northern roads and the prospects for the wool market in the spring, with the straightforward good humor of a man who considered a dinner guest to be a dinner guest regardless of title. Edmund had found this deeply restoring. Clara had been at dinner. She sat across the table from him and ate her soup, and participated in the conversation about wool prices and road conditions with the composed attention of a woman who has learned to make herself genuinely present in whatever room she happens to occupy. She did not look at him more than was natural for the circumstances. She did not avoid looking at him either. She was simply there, in the warm and ordinary way that she had been present at Blackmere, filling the space she occupied without effort and without performance. Edmund ate his dinner and talked about wool, and was more grateful for a plain meal and a fire and ordinary conversation than he had been for any evening in recent memory. After dinner, Mr. Hartley had gone to check on the stable, and Mrs. Hartley had gone to see to the children's bedtime, and Edmund and Clara had been left for a period of perhaps 20 minutes in the sitting room with the fire, and the settled quiet of a house becoming peaceful for the night. Clara had said, without looking up from the book she had picked up, "You have 3 letters in your coat pocket." "Yes," he said. Do you want to give them to me? He thought about this. He said, not yet. She looked up at him then. Why? He said, because I think I can say it better now than I could when I wrote them, and I would rather you have the better version. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to her book and said, all right. They had sat by the fire, each reading, until Mrs. Hartley came to say that the room upstairs was prepared. Clara had said good night in the calm and usual way, and Edmund had said good night in the same way, and that had been that, and he had gone to bed and slept 8 hours without waking, which was more continuous sleep than he had managed in several weeks. Now he was lying in the narrow bed in the morning light thinking about what he had said to her, that he could say it better now, and deciding whether this was true. He thought it was. The letters, all 3 of them, had been written in the voice of a man who was trying to explain himself to himself as much as to anyone else, a man working out on paper what he actually felt and why he had failed to act on it. They were honest letters. He was not ashamed of them, but they were written in the particular formal voice he used for letters, which was not quite his real voice, because he was not entirely sure he had ever used his real voice for anything personal in his adult life. He thought about what Holt had said. He thought about his father. He got up, he washed in the cold water from the basin, he dressed and went downstairs. Clara was already in the small breakfast room, with a cup of tea and the look of a woman who has been awake for some time, and has done whatever thinking she intended to do before anyone else arrived. She said, good morning. He said, good morning. He sat down across from her, and accepted the tea that appeared in front of him from the quiet maid and drank it, and looked at the window, which showed a grey morning and snow still lying heavy on the village street outside. Then he said, I should not have let you go. Clara set her cup down. She looked at him. I should not have said what I said to Holt, he said. I should not have stood in the corridor and said 7 words that were not true, and then stood at a window, and watched you walk to the gate in the rain, and got on a coach without saying anything to stop it. I had 11 weeks to say something and I did not say it, and I have spent the past 3 weeks sitting at my desk with a sealed letter that I did not send because I was still doing the same thing I have done my entire adult life, which is to stay behind the glass of the window rather than stand in the weather. She was quiet. She had her hands flat on the table, both of them, and her face was in that particular mode it went into when she was listening to something carefully and deciding what it meant. I am not asking you to forgive the letters unsent, he said, or the weeks of silence. I came here because the road was closed, and I am aware that is not sufficient logic for 40 miles in a December night, but it is the logic I had and I used it. I am here because I want to say what I should have said, and I would prefer to say it in a room rather than in a letter. She was quiet for another moment, then she said, what would you have said if you had said it at Blackmere? I would have said, he said carefully, that the library was more interesting when you were in it. That dinner was something I looked forward to rather than endured. That the margins of my Wordsworth are not private, since they say exactly what I was thinking when I wrote them, and what I was thinking was about more than Wordsworth. He paused. And I would have asked you to stay. Clara looked at him. The light from the window was thin and grey, and it fell across the table between them and lit the steam rising from the cups. You had 11 weeks, she said. I know, he said. You are not an easy man, she said. No, he said, I have been told this. You do not say things, she said. You stand in doorways. I notice this about you. You are always half in and half out of the room, as though you have not decided whether it deserves your full presence. Edmund said, that is a very accurate observation. I know, she said. I was watching you quite carefully for 11 weeks. He looked at her, she looked back at him. Neither of them looked away this time. He said, I am entirely in this room. She considered this. Then she said, yes, I can see that. Outside, the village of Harwick was going about its morning with the composed and practical energy of a place that has dealt with snow before and knows how to go on. The baker had cleared his step, and the smell of bread was moving down the east lane with the thin, cold air. A dog crossed the street in the middle distance, heading somewhere with the purposeful trot of an animal who has an appointment. Children were visible at the far end of the lane, throwing snow at each other with the focused joy of people who have been kept indoors for 4 days and have finally been released. Inside, in the warm breakfast room of the wool merchant's house, 2 people sat across a table with cups of tea going cold between them and arrived, carefully and without hurry, at an understanding that had been trying to come into being for 11 weeks. They talked for a long time. Edmund gave her the letters eventually, not that morning but in the afternoon, when they had talked through enough that the letters seemed like the right next thing rather than a substitution for talking. She read them in the sitting room while he walked with Mr. Hartley to check on Carrick, who had been stabled in the merchant's yard and had eaten an enormous quantity of hay, and appeared to be in excellent spirits about the whole enterprise. When Edmund came back, Clara was in the sitting room with the 3 letters in her lap and the Wordsworth open on the table beside her. She looked up at him when he came in. She said, "You wrote that the light in the library at Blackmere is very particular in the late afternoon." He said, "It is." She said, "I thought so too." He sat down, she handed him the letters, all 3. He put them in his coat pocket beside the letters that had remained unread. "The violet," she said, nodding at the book on the table. "I have been carrying it with me," he said, "since the morning you left." She looked at the book for a moment, then she said, "Then you had better keep it." He did. The snow began to ease that afternoon and the roads were expected to open within 2 days. Mrs. Hartley, who had said nothing about the situation directly but had clearly formed a view of it, arranged for Edmund to stay in the spare room for as long as the roads required, in the tone of a woman who considers the roads to have been providentially timed. Edmund stayed for 4 days. In those 4 days he had more genuine conversation than he had managed in the previous 4 years. He ate meals at a table where the talk was plain and warm and entirely free of the performance that attended dinners in the households of the great. He walked with Clara in the mornings on the village street when the snow allowed, and they argued about books and about history and about the state of the northern farms, which Clara had opinions about, and he found that her opinions were better informed than those of most men he knew. He watched her teach the Hartley girls, who were 8 and 6 and 11, and saw again what he had seen at Blackmere, which was a woman who could make a child understand something difficult while making it feel like the most natural thing in the world. On the 3rd evening, when the house was quiet and the Hartleys had gone up to bed, he sat by the fire and Clara sat in the chair opposite, and they did not talk very much, because they had talked a great deal, and had reached the kind of comfortable quiet that exists between people who have said enough to be at ease in each other's silence. He looked across at her. She was reading, the fire was low, the room was warm. He said, "Will you come back to Blackmere?" It was not quite a question, and not quite a statement. It was the kind of thing that sits in the space between. Clara turned a page. She did not look up. She said, "You have not asked me properly." He said, "I am asking now, properly." She looked up at him. She said, "As governess to Philippa." He said, "As whatever you choose. I would prefer something more permanent than governess to Philippa, but that is a conversation that requires a proper setting and a better night's rest than either of us has had in the last 4 days, and I am not going to have it in front of the dying embers of the Hartley sitting-room fire." She looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled, actually smiled this time, the full and unguarded version of the thing he had heard once across a dinner table at Blackmere, and which had gone through him like a key finding a lock. She said, "Then we had better get you home first." He said, "We." She said, "Did you imagine I was going to stay in Harwick while you rode 40 miles back alone?" He said, "I had hoped not." She went back to her book. Edmund sat back in his chair and looked at the fire and felt, for the first time in 11 weeks, the particular and uncomplicated sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He thought about 7 words said in a corridor. He thought about what a different kind of evening that had been. He thought that he would not spend the next 11 weeks looking at things through glass. They left Harwick on the morning of the 16th of December. Mrs. Hartley packed a basket of food for the road and pressed Clara's hand at the gate, with the quiet warmth of a woman who has understood the situation completely and is happy about it. The girls came to the door in their coats and waved until Clara and Edmund were beyond the bend in the east lane and out of sight. Mr. Hartley had arranged the loan of a small covered cart from the blacksmith, who had no use for it in the present weather and was glad to have it make itself useful. Clara rode in it, wrapped in the 2 blankets that Mrs. Hartley had also packed, with a warmer coat than the one she had arrived in because the Hartley household had produced one from somewhere, a thick wool coat of Mrs. Hartley's sister that was slightly too large but thoroughly warm. Edmund rode Carrick beside the cart, and the boy from the stable led the cart horse with the steady competence of someone who has been doing this since he was old enough to hold a rein. The roads south were better than the roads north had been 4 days earlier. A thaw had come in the night, not enough to clear the deep drifts on the high ground, but enough to firm up the road surface and reduce the snow in the open country from impassable to merely difficult. The sky was the clear blue of post-storm days, pale and sharp and throwing the white world into high relief, every shadow on the snow surface a precise line of blue-gray. They made good time. Edmund rode beside the cart, and they talked when the road was smooth enough for comfortable talking and were quiet when the track required attention. He watched Clara's face when she looked at the landscape, which she did with the open and attentive expression of a person who finds the world genuinely worth looking at. She noticed things. She commented on them not in the way that people make conversation about landscape, but in the way that people who actually see things name what they see, a particular quality of the light over the eastern fields, the way the snow had settled in the top branches of the bare oak trees to form shapes that looked like something else from the right angle. He found himself looking at the same things she looked at and seeing them differently. They reached Dunmore village at 2:30 in the afternoon and stopped at the inn for Carrick to be watered and for Clara to come down from the cart and walk for a while, which she did with visible relief, stamping the cold from her feet on the packed snow of the inn yard. Edmund ordered soup and bread inside, and they ate it at a table by the fire, and the innkeeper, who knew Edmund Caro by sight if not by close acquaintance, looked at the two of them with the particular expression of an innkeeper who has learned from long experience to observe without commenting, and brought them a second bowl of soup without being asked. They were back on the road by 3. The light was going by the time the gates of Blackmere came into view. Edmund had seen those gates from every direction and in every season and in every kind of light that the English year produces, and he had always experienced their approach with the same mixture of ownership and faint oppression that a man feels when the thing that defines him is also the thing that confines him. He had grown up inside those walls and taken them for what they were, the outer architecture of a life that had been arranged for him before he was old enough to arrange it for himself. He saw them differently now. Perhaps it was the December light, going from gold to copper behind the bare tree line. Perhaps it was the particular angle of approach from the south road that ran through the lower fields, which he rarely used. Perhaps it was the fact that he was looking at them after 4 days away, which was, he realized, the longest he had been away from Blackmere without being in London in the past 7 years. He thought it was none of these things. He thought it was that the person beside him in the cart was looking at the gates too, with her clear and attentive expression, and that whatever they looked like to her was something he found he wanted to know about. He said, "What do you think of it?" Clara looked at the gates and then at the wall and then at the upper windows of the hall just visible above the tree line. She said, "It is a house that keeps people out." "Yes," he said. "Or in," she said. He said, "Both." She looked at him. She said, "Did you choose it?" He said, "I was born into it." She considered this. She said, "That is not the same thing as being trapped in it." He said, "No, I know that now." The gates stood open. They had been standing open since Holt had been informed that morning, via a message sent by the Harwich post office on the first day the roads allowed, that Edmund was returning and would be bringing Miss Voss. Holt had read the message. He had told the housekeeper. He had asked the cook to arrange dinner for 3. He had gone to the governess's former room, which was still empty because Edmund had not made a decision about it, and had ensured that a fire was laid and the linens fresh and the lamp on the table filled. Then he had opened the gates and left them open. The cart came through first, then Edmund on Carrick. The gravel drive was cleared, the snow pushed back in tidy walls on either side, the work of the morning by the groundsmen who had been told to expect an arrival. The front of the hall was lit from within, the tall windows warm against the cold blue of the December evening. Holt was at the door. He said nothing until they had come to a stop and Edmund had dismounted and the boy had jumped down from the cart. Then he stepped forward and said, "Miss Voss." Clara looked down at him from the cart. She said, "Mr. Holt." Holt said, "Welcome back." He said it with the same measured tone he used for everything, which was the tone of a man who says what he means and trusts the words to carry their own weight without assistance. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," in the same tone, which was the tone of a woman who understood that some things are properly said in few words. Edmund came to the side of the cart and handed Clara down. She came down without fuss and looked at the front of Blackmere Hall with the same open expression she had used on the gates, taking it in. Edmund stood beside her. They looked at the house together for a moment. Then Clara said, "I never got to see it in the proper evening light. I always went in early in November." He said, "It is better in winter than in the summer. The stone goes a different color." She said, "Yes, I can see that." Holt took the coat and the saddlebag and said, "Dinner is at 7:30, Your Grace. I have put Miss Voss in the east room." Edmund said, "Thank you, Holt." Holt moved toward the door and then stopped and looked back at Edmund. Not a long look, a brief one, but in it was 31 years of service and 5 opinions carefully chosen, and one very long night of waiting for a man to stop being afraid of what he already knew. He said, "The fire has been laid in the library, Your Grace, in case you were planning to work in there this evening." Edmund said, "Yes, thank you." Holt went in. Edmund and Clara stood for another moment on the gravel drive in the last of the copper light. The stars were coming out. The grounds of Blackmere stretched away on all sides, white and still, and the house above them was warm and lit against the sky. Clara said, 11 things. He said, "What?" She said, "You said the word sorry appears 11 times in the letters, each one for a different specific thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "I counted." He said, "And?" She said, "I accept 11 of them." He said, "That is all of them." She said, "Yes," and went inside. Edmund stood on the drive for a moment longer. He could see Holt through the window, moving across the entrance hall with the measured efficiency of a man who has things in order. He could hear, very faintly, the sound of Clara speaking to someone inside, already making herself present in the house the way she always had, without effort and without performance. He breathed out in the cold air and watched the breath dissolve. 40 miles through a December storm. He would do it again. He went inside and closed the door behind him, and the cold stayed where it belonged on the outside of the glass, and the warmth was everything and all around. And Blackmere Hall, which had always been a house that kept its owner at a certain distance from his own life, felt for the first time in a long time like a place where a life could actually happen. In the library, the fire that Holt had laid was burning well. 2 chairs sat before it, as they had always sat, on either side of the grate. Neither of them was empty tonight. Holt did not tell anyone what he had said to Edmund in the corridor on the 17th day. This was not unusual. Holt never repeated the things he said in corridors, because the things said in corridors were matters between the person who said them and the person who needed to hear them, and a butler who shared such things would quickly find himself trusted with nothing worth hearing. He had given 31 years to this house and to the family that lived in it, and in that time he had held a very great number of such things, sealed in his chest the way good letters are sealed, private until the right moment, and then opened carefully and only once. The morning after Edmund and Clara returned to Blackmere Hall, Holt went about his morning duties with the same contained efficiency he brought to every morning. He consulted with the cook about the week's meals. He reviewed the household accounts with the housekeeper, a practical woman named Mrs. Croft, who had the admirable quality of never asking unnecessary questions. He arranged for the cart to be returned to the blacksmith in Harwick by the steward's boy, with a letter of thanks from Edmund and a payment that was, by all accounts, generous. He walked the house in the morning as he always did, checking the fires and the windows and the state of the rooms, making the small adjustments that keep a large household running so smoothly that no one living inside it notices the running at all. He walked past the library at 8:30. The door was slightly open. He paused. He did not look in. He listened for a moment and heard the sound of 2 voices, one lighter and one heavier, talking with the particular ease of people who have been talking for some time and have arrived at the kind of conversation that does not need to try hard to be what it is. He went on. He went down to his room off the kitchen passage, which was a small and orderly room with a desk and a chair and a shelf of books and a window that looked onto the kitchen garden, which in December was bare and brown but which in spring produced excellent beans. He sat at his desk. He took out a small notebook that he kept there, a plain notebook with a brown cover that he had kept for many years, and in which he wrote, in very small and careful handwriting, observations he did not say aloud but considered worth keeping. He thought for a moment. Then he wrote the fifth opinion, the best one. He closed the notebook. He sat for a moment and looked at the window and the bare kitchen garden and thought, with the private and uncelebrated satisfaction of a man who has done something right, that 31 years of watching a family from the inside of its walls had been, on balance, a life well suited to his particular talent for understanding people better than they understood themselves. He thought about a 9-year-old boy in a corridor who had not made a sound when the worst thing happened. He thought about a man who had ridden 40 miles in a December storm because a road was closed, and he had finally, at last, run out of reasons to stay on the wrong side of the window. Holt allowed himself, in the privacy of his room with the notebook closed on his desk and the kitchen garden bare outside the glass, a small and genuine smile. Then he put his notebook away and went back to work. Above him in the library the fire was burning. The Wordsworth sat on the table between the chairs with its cracked spine and its faint trace of a violet still pressed between pages 40 and 41. Nobody moved it. It stayed exactly where it was. The days that followed the return to Blackmere Hall had a quality that Edmund could not have named precisely, but which he recognized as new. Not dramatically new, not the new of upheaval and overturning, but the quieter and more lasting new of a thing that has been slightly corrected after a long misalignment. He worked in the library in the evenings. This was not itself new. He had worked in the library in the evenings for years. What was new was the absence of the particular quality of solitude that had attended that habit, the solitude that is not chosen but settled into, the way a person settles into a coat that does not quite fit because it is the only coat available. The library had been a room he occupied alone and had grown to regard as the natural condition of things. He had not known it was not natural until the 11 weeks that changed it. Clara worked in the library too in the evenings after Philippa was in bed. She had her own habits. She read at the table to the left of the fire. She made notes in a small book that Edmund had not looked at but understood, from the brief glances he caught when she was absorbed in something else, was a record of observations about whatever she happened to be reading, thoughts and counter-arguments and questions that the text had raised in her. She had, he had discovered, read more widely than almost anyone he knew, not in the showy way that some people read widely, accumulating titles like weapons, but in the absorbed and hungry way of someone who reads because the alternative is to go without something essential. They talked, not every evening and not about everything, but the conversation in the library had the character that he had noticed in their first weeks at Blackmere and had tried not to value too highly, the character of conversation between people who are genuinely interested in the same question and are not performing their interest for each other's benefit. Philippa was, to no one's great surprise, extremely pleased. She had said on the morning after Clara's return, "I knew you would come back," in the tone of a child who has been right about something and is trying very hard not to say so too loudly. Clara had said, "Did you?" Philippa had said, "Mr. Holt said so." "Did he?" Clara said. "He didn't say it exactly," Philippa said. "He said that your room was going to be kept ready, and Mr. Holt doesn't keep things ready for no reason." Clara had looked at the door of the study, beyond which Holt's footsteps could be heard moving away from it at a carefully unhurried pace. She had said, to no one in particular, "No, he doesn't." The question of what Clara's position at Blackmere was precisely was addressed on the 4th morning after their return. Edmund came to the library at 9 o'clock, which was an hour earlier than he usually appeared there. Clara was already at the table with her notebook and a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold while she was reading. She looked up when he came in, with the alert expression of someone who has been expecting something and is ready for it. He sat down across the table from her. He said, "I want to ask you something properly, in a proper room, which this is, and with sufficient sleep behind both of us, which is also the case." She set her pen down. She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to ask whether you would stay. Not as governess to Philippa, though if you are willing to continue that for the time being I would be grateful because Philippa has strong opinions on the subject and her Latin is improving, but as something more than that, as someone whose presence in this house is permanent and whose standing in it reflects that." Clara looked at him. She said, "You are asking me to marry you." He said, "I am asking you to consider it seriously, and to tell me honestly whether it is something you could want, not because of the house or the title or any external arrangement, but because of the specific man sitting across this table who rode 40 miles in a December storm and came back with a coat full of unsent letters, and has been working in this library for 17 years alone, and would very much prefer not to do so any longer." Clara was quiet for a moment. He waited. He had become somewhat better at waiting over the past few weeks, though it did not come naturally. She said, "I left a violet in your book." He said, "I know." She said, "That was 11 weeks ago and 4 days, and the answer was yes then too, but you are going to have to understand that I will argue with you about books and about estate management and about several historical matters where you are wrong." He said, "I am aware of this." She said, "And I will teach Philippa for as long as she needs teaching, and after that I will still be here, which is all I was trying to say with the violet if you had been paying attention." He said, "I was paying attention, I was simply afraid of it." She said, "I know, Holt told me." Edmund said, "Holt told you." She said, "He told me about your father, on the morning I came back. He met me in the passage and said, in the way that he says things, that you had been 9 years old once in a corridor, and that it had done some lasting damage that you had been working on correcting, and that he thought I should know." Edmund sat with this for a moment. He said, "He is an extraordinary man." She said, "He is, you should tell him so more often." He said, "Yes." They sat for a moment in the winter library, with the grey December morning outside the window, and the fire in the grate, and the Wordsworth on the table between them. Then Clara said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." She said, "To your question, yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I should have asked 11 weeks ago." She said, "You ask now, that is sufficient." He looked at her across the table. She looked back at him with that expression, the careful and open one, that he had spent 11 weeks trying not to think about and 3 weeks thinking about constantly, and which he intended, from this morning forward, to simply look at directly and without apology. He said, "The light in this room is very particular in the mornings too." She said, "I know, I have been noticing it since October." He said, "And you said nothing." She said, "I left a violet in your book." He said, "That is true, you did." They went back to their reading. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the December grounds of Blackmere Hall lay white and still under a sky that was going from grey to a thin and watery blue, the color of a sky that has decided to try for something better. Philippa, who had come to the library door at 9:30 on the pretense of returning a book, and had found the door ajar, and had stood in the hallway for approximately 45 seconds listening to the silence inside, went back to her room with the expression of a 9-year-old who has confirmed exactly what she already knew. She went to find Mrs. Greer. She said, "They are in the library." Mrs. Greer said, "Are they?" Philippa said, "They are not talking, they are just being there together." Mrs. Greer said, "Ah." Philippa said, "Is that good?" Mrs. Greer said, "In my experience that is the very best kind." Philippa went back to her Latin. She worked at it with more concentration than she had managed in the previous 4 days and finished 2 pages by lunchtime. She wrote a letter that afternoon. It was addressed to the wool merchant's house in Harwich, to Mr. and Mrs. Hartley and their 3 girls. She told them that Clara was back and that everything was better now, and that Edmund had gone and fetched her himself in the snow, which she considered the best thing her uncle had ever done in his life, which was, she admitted, not a very long competition. She also mentioned that the Latin was going well, and that Clara had said she might learn some Greek in the spring if she continued at this pace. She folded the letter and sealed it herself, and gave it to Holt with the afternoon post. Holt read the address on the front, and then set it in the post tray with the others. Then he went to the kitchen, and told Mrs. Greer that Miss Philippa had written her first letter entirely, without assistance or supervision. Mrs. Greer said, "Has she? Well." Holt said, "It appears she has her uncle's penmanship." Mrs. Greer said, "Is that good or bad?" Holt said, "It is improving." He went back down the passage to his room. He sat at his desk and opened his notebook and looked at what he had written the morning before. "The fifth opinion, the best one." He turned the page. He wrote in his small and careful hand, the 6th, ride carefully. Then he closed the notebook, because some things are complete when they are said, and do not need to be added to, and the account he had been keeping in the small brown notebook had reached, with these 6 words, the only ending it had ever been heading toward. He put the notebook back in the drawer. He folded his hands on the desk. Through the window, the kitchen garden sat under its blanket of December snow, and in the spring it would produce excellent beans, as it always had and always would, and the house above him was warm and lit, and had the particular quality of a house in which the people inside it have decided to be where they are, which is, in the end, the only thing that turns a building into a home. Holt sat at his desk for a little while longer in the quiet of the afternoon. He was satisfied. He had been patient for a very long time, and patience, in the end, is simply the name that sensible people give to the certainty that the right thing will happen if you give it enough room to arrive. It had arrived. The gate at Blackmere stood open in the pale December light, the way it always stood when the house was expecting someone, or when someone was expected home, which on the best days of a long life are the same thing. The crow that had sat on the gate on the grey morning in November was gone. It had found somewhere better to be. They all had.